Guenther Family History Family Vacations by Donald Guenther. I remember taking 3 vacations, one up to a camp by Powers, and the other 2 were trips to Portland. With so many kids, we had to take 2 cars until we got our new Econoline. That car was a beaut. Our Econoline could sit 8 people, but we managed to get 12 to 14 in the rig. When we'd get out, people would think, "How many Guenthers are there?" The year before, the Schroeder family had gotten a van, and Dory made fun of it. Then we got ours. Dory talks big about being proud of the big family and all, because she loves us, but she wasn't like that as a teenager. Ronnie, Bobby, and Louise had fortunately left home by the time we got our van. They were the lucky ones. The year before we got the van, an extremely humiliating event occurred. When we went to Portland, we took 2 cars. One car, a station wagon that Rick later tried to make into a dune buggy, and Dad's old Packard. The 2 cars were full of kids and Dad, while Mom stayed home. Mom knew how to get Dad out of the house. She'd pack him a big lunch full of goodies. Dad would have his lunch downed before we got to Weedsport. Having polished off his lunch, he'd turn barn sour and want to go home. The trips to Portland consisted of a visit to the zoo, grotto, and Multnomah Falls as part of a drive up the Columbia Gorge Scenic Highway. Mount Hood, and to top it all off, attend a professional football exhibition game. Dad would keep his window down, and those in the back seat of his car would freeze. When we were headed up the gorge, it got so cold in the back we pleaded with Dad to roll up his window. Finally, out of desperation, we held a box behind Dad's head, and the cold wind circled around onto him. He got mad, but rolled his window up. With carloads, we lived on the cheap. We'd camp out, so to speak. I hesitate to call what we did camping out. The boys had cheapo sleeping bags, and we'd get kicked out of the car. On one trip, we camped up on Mount Hood. That night got so cold, and the girls in the Econoline refused to let us in. Fiddy had prepared a large batch of cupcakes and started feeding them to us out the window in an effort to keep us quiet. Finally, we were let back into the van and headed down to buy tickets for the game. Unfortunately, we stood in the wrong line by mistake, and when the ticket booth opened, we had to go to the back of a long line. On the trip the year before we purchased the Econoline, Dad's Packard kept dying on him. We would push-start his car. At the zoo, I can remember circling that parking lot several times before his car started. We were totally humiliated. On the way home, just as we were crossing the bayfront out of Hauser, the car died for good. Thus, the Econoline purchase. Dad was a big whiner and didn't fare too well when we camped out. When we camped out up at Powers, I could still see him sleeping on a mattress he'd brought just so he didn't have to sleep in the rocks. We didn't sleep in campgrounds, didn't believe in them. They were for city folk. We had to find our own campsite. The rivers were always cold, but good for storing a watermelon or 2. We didn't have tents. I seem to remember an old tent, but by the time I came along, that tent had been long destroyed. 14 kids can do a lot of damage. No tents, junker cars, and a lot of desert. As a boy, these were the makings of a fun time. I can't remember any of us ever complaining, except on the Powers trip when Fid said she couldn't take it. Sleeping on rocks did her in. I didn't much care for that location either. Too many salamanders. As a rule, our vacations were disasters, and that's what made for a good vacation. Disastrous elements of surprise.